Hello and welcome back to the Hill and Valley podcast. This is our 7th episode where we're going to be talking about camera gear and also how you can be a better filmmaker with the gear you have now. Joel, how do you feel about the A7S?
Yeah, we have two A7Ss and we use them pretty much daily. We also have a Sony FX9 that we bring on a lot of productions, but I feel like when I think of my go-to camera system, it's definitely the A7S III.
Yeah, so I've actually been using the Sony A7S since the first generation back in 2015 or so when that camera came out. It was the first camera to do like internal 4K. Or actually, no, it was external 4K. But at the time, that was huge. You could output it to like an Atomos Shogun. But also it had things like 1080-60, which for me, I was like, that's amazing because I was always filming skateboarding in 720-60. And it drove me nuts that I had to switch resolutions to get higher frame rates. And then also they introduced S-Log2 at the time, which really revolutionized how I looked at filmmaking. I was like, I can color grade, I can get more interesting shots, and it really changed how I looked at filming skateboarding as well. My style switched from like the traditional follow cam fisheye stuff to more of like, you know, finding cool angles, making it a little more cinematic. There's more dynamic range so we could play with different types of scenes and exposures. But then when the A7S II came out, we quickly jumped on that because that included internal 4K. I think it was up to 30. It was 8-bit, but it was still like one of the first cameras to do 4K internally other than like the GH4. But for a long time, there was a big gap when the A7S II came out till the time the A7S III came out. I think it was like 3 or 4 years where it was like everybody else was innovating. Cameras were doing 4K internally. Other cameras were doing 4K 10-bit. And so we actually switched to Panasonic for a little bit. That's when we got the S1H because it could do 4K 10-bit internally up to 60 frames a second, which was huge. And we were on Panasonic for like 2 years, I think. We had 2 S1Hs. But by the time the A7S III came out, everybody was skeptical because they're like, oh, it's only going to be like getting up to par with what everyone else is doing. But it really far surpassed a lot of what was available on the market up until today, which is, 3 or 4 years later. So now we're looking at, is this thing still of the quality of the cameras that are coming out today, or is it something they're going to need to update soon?
Yeah, I mean, I remember when the A7S, I think it was the A7S II came out, the internet was freaking out about its low light capabilities. And back when I was getting into cameras, like actually my first camera was a Sony. It was one of those Alpha or A3000, I think it was called, some like $200 camera that came out in like 2012. But I wasn't that familiar with the newer Sony Alpha cameras, but I remember when I was looking into what camera to buy, especially for video, because I was looking to do both video and photo, everyone was raving about Sony's dynamic range and low light capabilities. And after using a few other cameras and then using a Sony, it kind of blew me away as well. And personally, that's one of the things that I enjoy most about these cameras. I feel like, especially when shooting in log, the flexibility you have in post with color grading and the dynamic range and exposure you can get out of these sensors is really, really impressive, especially for such a small camera body. Like a lot of times I'll be looking at the footage and like, all right, this is a cinema camera. It's small and looks like a photo camera, but for all intents and purposes, it's pretty much a cinema camera.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were turned off initially because, like you said, it looks like a photo camera. And we were definitely early adopters with like the A7S1 because at that time it was kind of like Android versus Apple, or like the Sonys were definitely better. They had the better specs, but when you picked one up, you're like, oh, what is this? Especially like the A-mount cameras. They were just like, the screens were low quality. The viewfinders were like weird. There's all this information on the screen. You're like, what the heck is any of this?
I've actually never used an A-mount Sony.
The A3000's A-mount.
No, it's E-mount.
Is it really?
Yeah, it was similar to the NEX cameras.
Oh, okay.
So I actually still have all those lenses that I bought for that first camera, and they're all crop sensor lenses. It was an APS-C, but yeah, the only cameras I've ever owned have all been E-mount.
Yeah, I mean, on that note, when I saw the first of the E-mount cameras, especially like the A6000, that's when my mind started thinking like, all right, these guys are going to be a major player pretty soon because they were doing things like introducing that mirrorless mount, having cameras that are higher resolution, 24 megapixels. They were shooting, the A6000 was shooting like 10 frames a second or something like that back in 2012 or 2014.
Yeah, whenever that was.
And so those were specs that I was like, wow, that's actually amazing. The image quality is amazing. I wish the camera system itself was a little easier to use, a little more user friendly. But then over time, they started introducing more features that were more user friendly and higher quality specs that were pretty much professional specs that were only found in like high-end cinema cameras like S-Log.
Right.
And that's something that other manufacturers were really hesitant to do. Like Canon always said, oh, if you're going to shoot video, you're going to use our cinema line. So don't think that we're going to give you C-Log in like a DSLR or mirrorless body. And then they ended up having to play catch up.
With Sony, yeah.
But yeah, that's a little bit of the history of our experience with the Sony cameras. I think that, like you said, the A7S III is our daily driver. We have two of them. The biggest thing for us is not only all of the features it's able to offer, but like you were mentioning, the size. It's a very small, easy camera to use. We can put it on a gimbal. We can, build it out so that it can sit on our tripod, and we can have all of the functionality we need to do interviews or even narrative work. We can put monitors on it pretty easily. We have a cage for it. We can pretty much do anything we need with it.
Yeah. Set it up with our wireless transmitter to send it to a director's monitor. It's interesting to me, like having the FX9 and using both the FX9 and the A7S so often. While you might need to use different adapters and cables and a couple different pieces of gear, at the end of the day, I think you can build them out to be pretty similar systems. I think the image quality in the FX9 is a little bit better, but there aren't a lot of situations where like we can't use our A7S for something that we could use our FX9 for. Which also, like just talking about the image quality, like a lot of interviews and bigger productions we do will use both cameras simultaneously. So for like a 2-camera interview setup, a lot of times our wide angle will be the FX9 and our tight camera will be the A7S. And while we can notice the difference between the images a little bit, I think with some simple like color correction, they pretty much look the same. So yeah, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on like when we use one versus the other? I feel like for me, it's mostly a convenience factor, or depending on the shot, like we're not going to get the FX9 on a gimbal. So if the shot requires some sort of stabilizer, or like if we're setting up our A7S like on the windshield of a car with a suction cup mount, like anything that requires a smaller size, I'll use the A7S. But also I think if it's just something quick and dirty, I'll always just pick up the A7S. It's a little bit quicker and easier to set up. But yeah, what are your thoughts when do you opt for one camera versus the other?
Yeah, so I think that between the two, they both solve similar problems just in a very different way. Like the FX9 is, I would say, built for convenience and quality, and I would say the same thing for the A7S, which is the beautiful thing about both of them, is that you're not really sacrificing much in the way of quality when compared to other cameras. Obviously, they don't shoot RAW, but you have a lot of flexibility with the internal codecs. The main thing I would look for is, fortunately for us, we're mostly doing a lot of like production work and not as much run and gun it as we used to, where like that's where the A7S shines, is like any circumstance you get caught in, you can get a decent video. Even if there's no light, it's so good in low light. It's small, so you can fit into different places. And the same can be said for the FX9. It is also a very convenient camera to use for everything except for the form factor. For certain things, like you said, putting on a gimbal, but you will see it's often used in things like reality TV, documentary, because it's good at being used in a pinch with larger crews, or even like as a run and gun shooter, because it has all of the audio interface, it has built-in NDs. So I would say the difference between the two for us is typically, we usually I have a pretty good idea of what we're going to get into when it comes to the project, but it all comes down to like how much planning we have. If all of the shots are planned out, we'll opt to use the FX9 because we know that we'll get the image we like. It's easy to work with. We can use different lenses with it and have it set up to the way that we want to work with it if it's something that we want to work more collaboratively on. The A7S can be used in that manner as well, but oftentimes if we're going to shoot something where we're a little bit less sure of the play-by-play, like how we're going to get each shot, we'll use something like the A7S because it's much more easy to, in a pinch, be able to put on a gimbal and get a shot with some camera movement, or, you know, use a handheld, use it on a tripod. Where the FX9, the convenience more so comes in with things like the audio interface, the NDs. Yeah. So it's really dependent on the type of project. Like if we were shooting with the A7S and we were doing like documentary work, it would be a lot harder to get the good sound and video out of it than it would be with the FX9, because we could use any of our mics without an adapter. It has a nice mount for a shotgun mic, where the A7S, it's easier to get a good picture out of it, but it's not as much geared towards sound. And if you're not working with a sound guy, then something like the FX9 is definitely the better option to have internal audio. But like I said, most of the time we're lucky that we get to record sound externally or have somebody working on sound, so that we don't need to sacrifice the quality for convenience. So over the years of experience I've had, I definitely have been guilty of to be one of the people that gets caught up with like, oh, what camera are you shooting on? You know, how's this camera going to solve a certain problem for me? And I feel like sometimes mentally I create more problems for myself to then solve with all of these cool little parts and pieces to play with, because it's fun. Yeah,
I was gonna say it's tough because that's an interesting part about this job. Like, you're definitely much more technically savvy than I am, but I still enjoy learning about gear and like building out a camera using all the accessories and handles and other equipment. But yeah, all the time that you spend worrying about your camera setup, you could be spending that time looking at the shot and figuring out what you can do to make it look better, or planning out your day of production. There's all sorts of things that you could be doing at that same time. I would say the expression gear doesn't matter isn't true. It's gear does matter, but not more than the project. Yeah. So if there's a way to get something done and you have a solution, I think that is, you can use that solution, and maybe like people will look down upon it, or maybe it's not the best solution, but it's better to actually be able to create and get a project done than it is to worry about like, oh, maybe we'll reschedule because I don't have this lens I wanted to shoot on. It's like, well, can you get that effect some other way in post? Can you use a filter? And I think that's something that knowing a lot about gear and being conscious, maybe not completely obsessed with gear, is important, because not only can you solve those problems more efficiently, but you know more workarounds and more solutions to achieve a similar effect or a similar solution. And just being aware that like nothing ever is going to go perfectly when it comes to making videos or films, and just being prepared for any problem to arise. And I think that's what gear does for us. It just solves those problems. Yeah, and we've talked about it quite a lot on this channel, but our equipment cart that we bring on as many productions as we possibly can, I think when that is fully set up, that's a good example of how like we bring so much gear on set, and a lot of times we don't use 95% of it. We pretty much just use the camera, lens, and tripod that we plan to, and whatever microphone. But since we're familiar with all the gear we have, and we've packed gear that is there to solve specific problems that we've encountered before, it's really nice having that resource of like, oh, this cable keeps falling and is getting in the shot. Let's grab a bongo tie or a safety cable or a clamp, like all these little things that really help out on production. But that being said, like when it comes to cameras, at the end of the day, you really just need a camera and a lens, and then it's up to you to make a project successful. Back when I was just getting into filmmaking and photography, I was always blown away by stuff on YouTube of people with like a Rebel T2i or whatever, making really good films. And like maybe the dynamic range wasn't as impressive as like the Sony A7S, but like being creative and telling a story like pretty much has nothing to do with gear. Gear is just like the problem solvers, or gear can be there to solve problems for you on set or while you're creating something. Yeah, I love your example of using a T2i to make something great, because I was like, when I had a T3i, I was like, oh, you know, how do I get that look that everybody got? And I felt like when I knew less about it, I was more like excited and more willing to just make things. And like to me, it didn't look bad because I didn't realize what the problems were. But the more you learn, and I feel like the more you understand about like certain
downfalls of certain systems, it gets in your head and you start to think like, oh, I can't get that shot because I heard that the quality is like this way, or I don't have the proper resolution to do that. And it's like, does it matter as much as you think it does? And it doesn't always, but I feel like the good thing about knowing those downfalls is sometimes you can lean into them and play to the advantage of that, or like it becomes more of a stylistic choice. Like you said, maybe if you don't have enough dynamic range, it becomes a silhouette, or maybe you choose a different lighting setup, or you have to learn more about bouncing light, so there's always another solution around the corner.
Yeah. And that kind of connecting to that, I feel like if you're starting out and you only have one camera and it's not the highest quality, and you're thinking about gear, like I was in that position where I was like, oh, I want to get all these lights, I want to get these crazy fast lenses that are way too expensive for me. To anyone who's in that position and kind of obsessing over gear, or like you were saying, like limiting themselves because they don't have gear, I think you just gotta go out there and start making things and keep making things, and then just kind of take a mental note of what the problems you're running into are. And if you can't find like creative ways to get around them, or you can, and then you realize that what you really want to do is still being blocked by some issue you're having with your camera, I feel like only then you can like start building a list of like what gear is actually going to improve the quality of your videos, whether that's a monitor. Maybe you do a bunch of projects and then as you're editing you realize that like you're missing focus on a lot of things because you can't see your image large enough on set. Maybe then invest in a 5 or 7 inch monitor. But I feel like I was in a position where I was like not creating things because I felt like my gear wasn't good enough, and I was just paying way too much attention to that. So I think make things, and then if you keep having the same issue with your gear, then you can really consider an upgrade, and I think it'll be more worth it.
Yeah, and also really depends on your project and your needs, because something like the A7S III we've invested in because oftentimes we're shooting for corporate and commercial stuff where like we're not going to get a second chance to shoot this, and we don't have the opportunity to adjust the lighting or go wait 5 minutes to get another light. So those are times where the camera like this enables us to still make something good, and maybe not maybe it's not the best work because obviously we would opt to get a light or take more time. But sometimes you don't have that option when you're getting paid to do it. But if you're starting out and you're making things for yourself, I would say opt for creating a better environment for the shoot than trying to get a better camera that will solve more problems. Whether that's like you learn how to make a diffusion panel with like a bed sheet. That will actually do way more for the image and for the project as a whole to create the look you want than it would be to get another camera. Same with like things like lenses. Like we play around with vintage lenses all the time that are like $50, and we like the look way more than a lot of our Sony lenses sometimes. But the Sony lenses we need because there's oftentimes situations where we're filming something where we can't play around with the look of it and the focus, and
it needs to be sharp, it needs to have autofocus, we need to have everything that these lenses provide, even though you can get a lot of great things with much cheaper equipment. Like lenses especially.
Perfect example is the Helios.
I bought a Helios on eBay like 3 years ago for $40 or $50. And they just shot Dune 2 on it, right? And so that's my favorite lens to use here. Obviously, like I don't use it as often maybe as I'd like to, but like you said, when you're getting paid to do something and there's an expectation of cleanliness in the image, even though it's maybe not as visually exciting, like you got to use these photo lenses that are going to make sure that your client's happy and everything. But whenever we get to do something a little bit more creative, I love playing around with the vintage lenses and embracing the some of the like the flaws they have, or like some people complain the Helios is way too flary, but depending on your lighting environment, that can be really, really nice. But yeah, find cheap lenses. Like the first lens I bought, I think back with my first camera, my parents got me a telephoto lens for Christmas that was pretty cheap. It was the crop sensor Sony one from, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago. But the first lens I actually bought with my own money was just like a 35 millimeter prime lens. I think it was like Samyang or Rokinon maybe. So it was like a cheap lens, and like it had its drawbacks. It would hunt for focus. It made a noise when it would focus. But even that, I was like, all right, I need a 2.8 lens because I didn't have one at the time. And that was good for me learning what the benefits and drawbacks of a new lens would be. And I feel like each new lens you get, each new piece of gear, you kind of have to work with it and learn what it achieves for you and what it doesn't, and what you might need a different piece of gear for. So yeah, I think it doesn't, like, learning how to utilize gear in the best way possible does not have to be expensive.
Yeah, and I think being limited often forces creativity, and that's when you learn. That's when you create some of your best work. I mean, half the time when we're shooting something, like, we're using stuff like window shades or bed sheets to diffuse light. Like, you know, it doesn't have to be a scientific. It's film is an art, you know.
Yeah.
Like, there is a scientific side to it where you could be like, oh, you know, is that bed sheet creating a color cast? But like, maybe you like the color cast, and things like that we use all of the time, like DIY. Like right now we're using these Lowe's bounce boards. Like we literally just bought these at Lowe's, and we actually like them a lot better than the one that's made to do that because of the quality of light it offers. It's not as punchy. It's a little softer. So there's so many things like that we found. We bought the nice expensive version of it, and then we're like, oh, I actually like this cheap DIY version better, or like maybe it's easier to use, or you can have more of them. And I think the more films I've worked on, the more I've realized that like they're just using whatever creates the look they like. It's not, you know, there's a product made for it to solve that problem, but it's often emulated off of what somebody did like DIY years ago. Yeah, just because that's what was available to them.
Yeah, I feel like filmmaking never becomes not scrappy, you know, like you're always trying to solve problems on set and like you're chasing a look that you're after, and you can use anything and everything in your environment or with the gear you brought to achieve those looks, even if it's literally a piece of trash that you're propping a camera up to get an angle or something.
Using some tin foil to bounce some light.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what's fun about it to me, is that even though we have like thousands of dollars worth of expensive gear and cameras and lenses and everything, it's still fun being having limitations put on you and then getting creative with how you solve those problems.
Yeah, I think as long as it's all about the result, the steps you take to get there are more so just fun, and that's the creative part. And like I feel like people sometimes get hung up on like, oh, I don't have the right screw for this, or I don't have that. And it's like you said, maybe you just throw your camera on a sandbag and that gets you the angle you want. You didn't have to go buy a new tripod that gets lower. Yeah, or like masking tape even. Like gaff tape is great, but like anything you have around your house, there's so many filmmaking tools that aren't meant to be that, but if you use it the right way, it can be. Yeah, I think as long as it's fun to play around, but if you have like intention and you know what you're going for and why you're going for that, that's like the key to it, really. That will definitely keep everything moving and the process and the intention to be true. I think, yeah, like you said, until you run into a problem, there's like this whole YouTube rabbit hole thing. Like, it's such a great resource, but also you end up chasing like these things you're being told, like, oh, I need a full frame camera, and now I need 10-bit, and now I need raw video, and now I need a medium format camera, and now I need a 2.8 lens, and now I need a prime lens.
Now I need a
Cine lens. Yeah, and it's like, until it's affecting your work directly, like, then hold off on making any purchases. Instead, try and see if you can get a similar look and feel from what you already have, and think about like what's the narrative of your project, or like what's the meaning behind your project, and does that actually benefit you, or like do you need to do a tracking shot with autofocus, or would it look good with a static shot, you know, like. Yeah, I think when you're like obsessing over gear and thinking about needing newer and better and more expensive gear, try to think of yourself more so as a director of a film than the technical camera operator, you know, because like you can make really creative and great films with really cheap gear, and you might get hired to direct a film where maybe there's a budget behind it and the person operating the camera is using a nicer camera, but it's your ideas and vision and creativity with how to achieve the look you're going for that's gonna be compelling in your work.
And so, yeah, like you were saying, like come up with alternative options. If there's a technical thing that you're lacking, come up with like maybe reconsider your shot, even if it's not what you had in mind. Like look at your environment, try reframing it, try a different lens if you have it.
Or try collaborating. See if there's somebody that's more, more interested in the camera work, and you can direct and create the project. Because I think that's, at the end of the day, that's the most important part. And I feel like it often gets overlooked, and you see people later in their careers being like, oh, I'm going to be the director now because like I mastered the camera trade, but like I didn't get to make what I wanted because I was so busy focusing on the camera, and now that doesn't matter as much to me anymore. And I think it's important to know the gear because it creates solutions to problems. It expands what you can do. But if you're writing a script based on like, oh, I have this camera, I know I can shoot in low light, so I'm going to set the scene at night. It's like, that's backwards,
Yeah.
So
if the scene has to be at night for the story, then you might consider using a camera that excels in low light rather than planning it around your gear. Which, to be honest, I think we've sometimes been guilty of, but rarely for like client projects. But like whenever we get a new piece of gear, it's fun to play around with it.
Yeah, we'll shoehorn it into a project. For sure.
It's like we're definitely flying FPV for this not interview, but like something where it doesn't really call for it. But I mean, that's for us, and we do that when we have the time and flexibility to. And honestly, that's still valuable experience, though. I think, especially when you have a new piece of gear, getting as familiar with it as you can and understanding what it excels at, what it lacks in.
For us, it's often like, what do we want to get paid to do, and how can we show that to people? So even if it's something that's like unrelated, like you said, the FPV is a great example. We'll fly FPV oftentimes, even if it's like kind of unnecessary, because we're like, is it going to be a good portfolio piece that we could show to somebody that owns a large facility that needs a tour of it?
Right.
So just to show that we have those skills and can achieve that look and feel, even though it's not always necessary, is important. But I feel like that's kind of a different conversation.
Right. Yeah, so I guess at the end of the day, gear does matter, but probably not as much as a lot of people think. It's much more important to be creative and get out there and make videos or take photos and do what you want to do. Don't let the gear hold you back.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it should be solving problems and not creating more problems for you.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. All right. Well, thank you so much for watching this episode of the Hill and Valley podcast. Be sure to check out the rest of our channel. We do a lot of videos about camera gear, filmmaking, the industries we work in, some tutorials, gear reviews. But yeah, be sure to subscribe and like the video. Leave us a comment if there's any other topics you'd like to see in a future episode. Thanks again for watching.